Fatigue is one of the most common complaints people bring to a doctor, and it has an unusually long list of possible causes, from poor sleep to thyroid issues to depression to a long list of other medical conditions, with iron deficiency being just one item on that list, though a genuinely common one, particularly in certain groups. Surveys of primary care visits consistently find fatigue among the top handful of reasons patients seek medical attention, and the difficulty doctors face in evaluating it is precisely that so many different systems in the body, from the thyroid to the gut to mental health to basic nutrient status, can each independently produce a very similar subjective experience of feeling tired, unmotivated, or low on energy. Before going any further, it is important to be direct about something. Anemia, the medical condition involving insufficient healthy red blood cells, often caused by iron deficiency, is diagnosed through blood tests and treated under medical supervision, sometimes with prescription-strength iron supplements, dietary changes, or treatment of an underlying cause if the iron deficiency is being driven by something like internal bleeding that needs to be identified and addressed directly. No combination of foods reverses anemia on its own in every case, and assuming fatigue is caused by iron deficiency without an actual blood test can mean missing a different, sometimes more serious underlying cause that genuinely needs medical attention. With that said, there is real substantial nutrition science behind iron's role in energy levels, and for people who are not significantly iron deficient but are running on the lower end of adequate iron status, or for people working to support their levels alongside medical treatment for diagnosed deficiency, dietary iron intake is a legitimately useful piece of the picture. Iron's connection to energy is not some vague wellness claim. It has a very specific, well-understood physiological basis. Iron is a core structural component of hemoglobin, the protein inside red blood cells responsible for binding oxygen in your lungs and carrying it to tissues throughout your body. When iron levels run low, your body produces less functional hemoglobin, which means each red blood cell carries somewhat less oxygen than it normally would. Since virtually every cell in your body depends on adequate oxygen delivery to produce energy efficiently through cellular respiration, even a modest reduction in oxygen carrying capacity can translate into the kind of pervasive, hard-to-pin-down tiredness that people with mild to moderate iron deficiency commonly describe, well before levels drop low enough to meet the clinical definition of anemia. This earlier stage, sometimes called iron deficiency without anemia, can still produce noticeable fatigue, reduced exercise tolerance, and difficulty concentrating in some people, even though standard blood tests for anemia specifically might still come back within a broadly normal range, depending on which markers are checked. Iron also plays a role in several other energy-related processes beyond oxygen transport, including specific enzymes involved in mitochondrial energy production, the same cellular structures responsible for converting nutrients into usable energy throughout the body. This gives iron deficiency a kind of double impact on energy levels, affecting both how efficiently oxygen reaches your tissues and how efficiently those tissues use that oxygen once it arrives, which is part of why correcting a genuine iron deficiency under appropriate medical guidance often produces a fairly noticeable improvement in energy levels for people who were truly deficient. It is also worth being clear that anemia itself is not always about iron specifically, even though iron deficiency anemia is the most common form worldwide. Vitamin B12 deficiency and folate deficiency can each independently cause a different type of anemia, sometimes called megaloblastic anemia, through an entirely different mechanism related to red blood cell formation, rather than hemoglobin's oxygen-binding capacity specifically. This matters practically because someone who focuses exclusively on iron-rich foods while having an undiagnosed B12 or folate deficiency would not see their fatigue improve, since they would be addressing the wrong nutrient entirely. Vitamin B12 deficiency is a particular concern for strict vegans, since B12 is found almost exclusively in animal products, as well as for older adults, since the ability to absorb B12 from food can decline with age due to reduced stomach acid production, and for anyone taking certain long-term medications, including some used for acid reflux and the diabetes medication metformin, both of which have documented associations with reduced B12 absorption over time. This is yet another reason why a proper blood panel, rather than an assumption that any fatigue must be iron-related, is the more reliable starting point, since a comprehensive panel can distinguish between these different potential causes rather than leaving someone to guess. So, which foods are actually worth focusing on, and how does dietary iron intake realistically work? Iron in food comes in two forms with meaningfully different absorption rates, and understanding this distinction makes a real practical difference in how to approach this. Heme iron, found in animal products including red meat, poultry, and fish, is absorbed considerably more efficiently by the human digestive system, typically somewhere in the range of 15 to 35% of the iron present, depending on overall iron status and other factors. Lean red meat, particularly beef, and organ meats like liver, are among the most concentrated heme iron sources available, with liver in particular containing several times the iron content of an equivalent amount of muscle meat, along with a substantial amount of vitamin B12, another nutrient closely tied to energy levels and red blood cell production. Poultry and fish also contain meaningful, if somewhat lower, amounts of heme iron compared to red meat and liver, and represent a reasonable middle ground option for anyone who eats meat but prefers to limit red meat intake for other dietary or health reasons. For people who eat meat and are specifically looking to support iron intake, a few servings of red meat per week, or liver on a less frequent basis given its more concentrated nutrient content and correspondingly higher vitamin A content, which should not be consumed in excess, are reasonable, well-supported dietary choices. Non-heme iron, found in plant foods including lentils, beans, spinach, and pumpkin seeds, is absorbed considerably less efficiently, generally somewhere in the range of 2 to 20%, with the exact rate depending heavily on what else is eaten in the same meal. Lentils are one of the more concentrated plant sources of iron and also provide a substantial amount of fiber and plant protein, making them a genuinely useful staple food for anyone, including vegetarians and vegans, looking to support iron intake through diet. Other legumes, including chickpeas, kidney beans, and black beans, offer a similar combination of moderate iron content alongside fiber and protein, and rotating between different legumes rather than relying on just one adds welcome dietary variety alongside the iron benefit. Spinach and other dark leafy greens contain meaningful iron content as well, although spinach also contains oxalates, compounds that can somewhat bind iron and reduce its absorption, which is part of why spinach alone is a less efficient iron source in practice than its iron content on a nutrition label might suggest. Pumpkin seeds, in addition to the zinc and vitamin E discussed in other contexts, are also a reasonable source of non-heme iron, and a convenient way to add a bit more iron to a varied diet through snacking rather than through a larger meal change. The efficiency gap between heme and non-heme iron is exactly why pairing strategy matters so much for anyone relying primarily on plant-based iron sources. Vitamin C has been shown in research to meaningfully improve non-heme iron absorption, in some studies multiplying absorption several-fold when a vitamin C source is consumed in the same meal as a non-heme iron source, by helping convert iron into a more absorbable form in the digestive tract. This is why a lentil dish paired with tomatoes, bell peppers, or a side of citrus fruit is, in practical absorption terms, a meaningfully better combination than the same lentils eaten alongside something with no vitamin C content at all. On the flip side, certain compounds can significantly inhibit non-heme iron absorption when consumed in the same meal, most notably the tannins in tea and coffee and the calcium in dairy products. This does not mean someone needs to avoid tea, coffee, or dairy entirely, but spacing them an hour or so away from iron-rich meals, rather than drinking a cup of tea or having a glass of milk directly alongside an iron-focused meal, is a reasonable, evidence-supported adjustment for anyone specifically trying to optimize their iron intake from plant sources. For a fourth practical option beyond red meat, lentils, and pumpkin seeds, fortified foods are worth mentioning, since many countries require or encourage iron fortification of staple foods like bread, breakfast cereals, and flour, specifically because dietary iron deficiency has historically been common enough in the general population to warrant a public health response. Checking nutrition labels for iron content and choosing fortified whole grain options when reasonable is a low-effort way to add some incremental iron intake without requiring any specific recipe or meal planning, particularly useful for anyone with a more limited diet due to appetite changes, dietary restrictions, or simply personal preference. For people who want a concrete starting point rather than a vague intention, here is roughly how this could look across a typical week. A meal built around lentils, perhaps a simple lentil and vegetable soup or a lentil dish seasoned with tomatoes and peppers, covers both the non-heme iron and the vitamin C pairing discussed earlier in a single dish, which is a genuinely efficient way to approach this rather than treating iron and vitamin C as separate items to track. For people who eat meat, including lean beef or another red meat a couple of times a week, perhaps alongside a side of roasted bell peppers or a citrus-based salad dressing, combines a concentrated hemi-iron source with additional non-hem iron and vitamin C in the same sitting. A handful of pumpkin seeds as a snack, ideally not eaten alongside a cup of tea or coffee given the absorption-inhibiting effect of tannins mentioned earlier, is a simple way to add incremental iron intake without much planning. None of this requires an elaborate meal plan or unusual ingredients. It is mostly about being slightly more intentional with food combinations that were probably already reasonably healthy to begin with. It is also worth mentioning an old, somewhat overlooked practical tip that has some genuine research support. Cooking acidic foods, such as tomato-based sauces, in cast iron cookware can measurably increase the iron content of the food itself, since a small amount of iron leaches from the cookware into the food during cooking, particularly with longer cooking times and more acidic ingredients. Research measuring this effect has found genuinely significant increases in iron content in some dishes prepared this way compared to the same recipe made in non-reactive cookware. This is not a primary strategy anyone should rely on as their main source of dietary iron, but for someone who already owns or is considering cast iron cookware for other reasons, it represents a small, free, incidental benefit worth being aware of. It is worth being specific about who is more likely to benefit from paying closer attention to iron intake, since iron needs genuinely differ between groups in ways that matter practically. Women who menstruate have meaningfully higher iron requirements than men of the same age due to regular blood loss, and iron deficiency is considerably more common in this group as a direct result, particularly for women with heavier or longer menstrual periods. Pregnant women have substantially increased iron needs to support increased blood volume and fetal development, which is why iron status is routinely checked and often specifically supplemented during prenatal care. Vegetarians and vegans, due to relying entirely on the less efficiently absorbed non-heme iron form, generally need to be more deliberate about iron intake and pairing strategies than people who eat meat regularly. Older adults are another group worth mentioning, both because dietary variety sometimes narrows with age for various reasons, and because certain medications and digestive changes common in older age, including reduced stomach acid production, which is needed to help absorb iron, can reduce how efficiently iron is absorbed even when dietary intake looks adequate on paper. Athletes, particularly endurance athletes, also have somewhat elevated iron needs and a documented higher rate of iron deficiency, related partly to a phenomenon involving the breakdown of red blood cells during intense, repetitive impact, such as running, and partly to a temporary inflammatory response after intense exercise that can reduce iron absorption for a period of time afterward. There are some mistakes worth flagging here. The first and most important is self-diagnosing fatigue as iron deficiency without an actual blood test, and then either taking iron supplements unnecessarily or assuming dietary changes alone will resolve fatigue that is actually being caused by something else entirely. Iron supplementation without a documented deficiency is not harmless. Excess iron accumulation in the body, a condition called hemochromatosis, when caused by an underlying genetic predisposition or from chronic oversupplementation, can cause real organ damage over time, particularly to the liver, and unsupervised high-dose iron supplementation in someone who does not actually need it is not a risk-free wellness habit. A simple blood test, checking markers like ferritin and hemoglobin, is genuinely the only reliable way to know whether iron deficiency is actually present, and that test is inexpensive and widely available through any doctor. The second mistake is ignoring the absorption factors discussed earlier and assuming that eating iron-containing foods automatically translates into proportionally improved iron status, when in practice pairing choices, timing relative to inhibitors like tea and coffee, and the heme versus non-heme distinction all meaningfully affect how much of that dietary iron actually gets absorbed and used. A related version of this mistake is focusing heavily on iron content listed on a nutrition label without accounting for whether that iron is in the heme or non-heme form, since two foods with similar listed iron content can deliver meaningfully different amounts of usable iron depending on that distinction and on what else is eaten alongside them. The third mistake, particularly relevant for anyone who has been diagnosed with genuine iron deficiency anemia by a doctor, is relying on diet alone to correct a significant deficiency when prescribed supplementation has been recommended, since dietary intake alone is typically a much slower and less reliable way to correct an already established, clinically significant deficiency compared to appropriately dosed supplementation under medical guidance, even though diet remains a valuable tool for maintaining adequate iron status afterward and preventing recurrence. If fatigue is persistent, significant, accompanied by other symptoms like unusual paleness, shortness of breath with ordinary activity, dizziness, brittle nails, unusual cravings for non-food items, or heavy menstrual bleeding, that combination of symptoms is worth bringing to a doctor specifically, rather than assuming it can be addressed through diet alone. These are classic signs associated with more significant iron deficiency in clinical practice, and a doctor can run the appropriate testing, identify whether iron deficiency is actually present, investigate any underlying cause if it is, such as heavy menstrual bleeding or gastrointestinal blood loss that needs its own evaluation, and guide appropriate treatment, which dietary changes alone are not equipped to substitute for in a case of genuine, clinically significant deficiency. Stepping back, the broader and more honest framing here is that iron-rich foods are a genuinely useful, evidence-supported way to support adequate iron status as part of an overall varied diet, and they can meaningfully help maintain energy levels for people whose fatigue is, at least in part, related to borderline or mild iron status. They are not, however, a substitute for proper diagnosis and treatment of clinically significant anemia, which remains a medical matter requiring blood testing and often medical-grade supplementation or treatment of an underlying cause. Treating dietary iron as one useful tool within a broader picture that includes proper medical evaluation when fatigue is significant or persistent reflects both what the nutrition research actually supports and what genuinely serves your health better than either extreme of ignoring diet entirely or expecting it to replace medical care.